Karen Matthews adjusted her oversized sunglasses and checked her phone for the third time in 5 minutes. The summer heat in London was unbearable, and she was already regretting wearing her new designer heels for this tourist trap visit to Buckingham Palace. She had flown all the way from Beverly Hills specifically to see the famous changing of the guard ceremony. But now that she was here, surrounded by sweaty tourists and screaming children, the whole experience felt beneath her. She popped a fresh piece of mint gum into her mouth, the cool flavor providing some relief from her growing irritation. Karen prided herself on being a sophisticated traveler, someone who appreciated culture and history, but this crowd was testing her patience. A family with 3 young children pushed past her, their sticky fingers leaving marks on her white Chanel blazer. "Excuse me," she called out sharply, but they were already lost in the sea of people. Karen rolled her eyes and muttered under her breath about the decline of basic manners in society. She had expected London to be more refined, more civilized than this chaos. The crowd began to surge forward as the ceremony time approached. Karen found herself pushed closer to the palace gates, her perfectly styled blonde hair now damp with perspiration. She clutched her limited edition Hermes bag tighter, paranoid that someone might try to snatch it in this madness. As the first sounds of military music echoed across the courtyard, Karen felt a surge of excitement despite her discomfort. She had been looking forward to this moment for months, ever since her divorce settlement had given her the freedom to travel wherever she pleased. This trip to London was supposed to be her fresh start, her chance to prove to herself and everyone back home that she was thriving. The Royal Guards began their march, their red uniforms pristine and their movements synchronized with military precision. Karen raised her phone to capture the perfect Instagram shot, already composing the caption in her mind. Something about experiencing true British culture and heritage would play well with her followers back in California. But as she tried to focus her camera, a particularly tall man stepped directly in front of her view. Karen tapped him on the shoulder impatiently. "Excuse me, I was here first," she said with the authority of someone accustomed to getting her way. The man barely glanced back and made no effort to move. Karen's jaw tightened as she chewed her gum more aggressively. This was exactly the kind of inconsiderate behavior that made travel so frustrating. She had paid good money for this experience, and she wasn't about to let some random tourist ruin her photo opportunity. She tried moving to the left, but another group of people blocked her path. To the right, a family with a stroller created an impenetrable barrier. Karen felt trapped, her claustrophobia beginning to kick in as the crowd pressed closer together. The guards were now directly in front of the area where she stood, but her view remained completely obstructed. Her phone battery chose that moment to drop to 15%, adding another layer of stress to an already frustrating situation. Karen had specifically charged it to 100% that morning, anticipating she would need it for photos and videos throughout the day. Now she faced the choice of conserving battery or missing the shots she had traveled thousands of miles to capture. The ceremonial music grew louder, and the crowd's excitement became palpable. Children were lifted onto shoulders, phones and cameras were raised high, and everyone seemed to be having the magical experience that Karen had envisioned for herself. Everyone except her. She watched as other tourists effortlessly captured perfect photos and videos, their faces glowing with joy and wonder. A couple next to her was taking selfies with the guards in the background, laughing and embracing as they created memories that would last a lifetime. Karen felt a familiar pang of loneliness, the same feeling that had haunted her throughout her marriage and had only intensified since her divorce. The ceremony continued with its traditional pageantry, but Karen found herself focusing more on her growing frustration than on the historical significance unfolding before her. She had spent weeks researching the best viewing spots, the optimal timing, and even the weather forecast. She had planned everything perfectly, yet here she was, unable to enjoy the experience she had so carefully orchestrated. Her designer heels were beginning to pinch her feet, a painful reminder that style didn't always align with practicality. The heat was making her makeup run, and she could feel sweat stains forming under the arms of her expensive blazer. This was not the elegant, sophisticated experience she had imagined when she booked her first-class flight to London. As the ceremony reached its climax, Karen made one final attempt to push forward for a better view. She squeezed between two tourists, earning annoyed looks and muttered complaints. Her gum had lost most of its flavor, becoming a tasteless wad in her mouth as she concentrated on navigating the crowd. Finally, she managed to find a small gap between people that offered a partial view of the guards. She raised her phone quickly, determined to capture at least something for her social media. Through her screen, she could see the elaborate uniforms, the precise movements, and the proud bearing of the soldiers who performed this ceremony day after day. For a moment, Karen forgot about her discomfort and frustration. There was something genuinely moving about witnessing this tradition that had continued for centuries. The guards maintained their stoic expressions and perfect posture, despite the chaos of tourists surrounding them. She found herself appreciating their dedication and professionalism. But as she tried to zoom in for a closer shot, someone bumped into her elbow, causing her phone to shake just as she pressed the capture button. The resulting photo was blurry and unusable, the culmination of a morning filled with small disappointments and mounting irritation. Karen lowered her phone and surveyed the scene around her. The ceremony was beginning to wind down and soon the crowds would disperse. She had one last chance to salvage something meaningful from this experience, but she needed to act quickly. The guards would be marching past her position momentarily, offering what might be her final opportunity for the perfect shot. She positioned herself as strategically as possible, elbowing past a teenager who was texting instead of watching the ceremony. Karen felt justified in her assertiveness. At least she was actually paying attention to the cultural significance of the moment, unlike these distracted younger tourists who seemed more interested in their phones than in the living history surrounding them. The lead guard approached her section of the crowd, his tall black hat and red uniform creating a striking silhouette against the palace facade. This was her moment, Karen realized, her chance to capture the image that would make all the morning's frustrations worthwhile. Karen raised her phone with determined precision, finally having found the perfect angle to capture the approaching guard. His uniform was immaculate, every detail from the golden buttons to the pristine white gloves speaking of centuries of military tradition. The morning sun caught the polished surface of his boots as he marched in perfect rhythm with his fellow soldiers. She held her breath, waiting for the exact moment when he would be positioned ideally within her frame. This photograph would be the centerpiece of her London album, the image that would prove to everyone back home that her solo travel adventure was everything she had claimed it would be. Her finger hovered over the capture button as the guard drew nearer. The crowd around her seemed to sense the importance of the approaching moment, and conversations hushed to respectful whispers. Even the children stopped their restless fidgeting to watch the spectacle unfold. Karen felt a surge of pride at being part of this quintessentially British experience, something that connected her to centuries of royal tradition and pageantry. As the guard came within perfect range, Karen pressed the capture button multiple times in rapid succession, ensuring she would have several options to choose from later. Through her phone screen, she watched as his face remained completely impassive, trained never to react to the tourists who gathered daily to witness his ceremonial duties. But just as she lowered her phone to check the quality of her shots, disaster struck in the most unexpected way. The piece of gum she had been chewing throughout the morning, now flavorless and forgotten in her mouth, suddenly slipped from between her teeth. Karen felt it leave her mouth but was powerless to stop its trajectory as it sailed through the air in a perfect arc. Time seemed to slow as she watched in horror. The gum, pink and clearly visible against the backdrop of red uniforms and golden decorations, flew directly toward the approaching guard. Karen's mouth opened in shock, but no sound emerged as she realized what was about to happen. The sticky wad landed with a soft but audible impact directly on the guard's left cheek, just below his tall black hat. The bright pink gum created a jarring contrast against his pale skin and the deep red of his uniform collar. For a split second, nothing happened. The guard continued his march as if nothing had occurred, his training and discipline preventing any immediate reaction. Karen felt the blood drain from her face as the full magnitude of what had just happened hit her. She had just assaulted a member of the Queen's Guard with a piece of chewed gum. Around her, other tourists began to notice what had occurred, and she could hear gasps and whispers spreading through the crowd like wildfire. Her first instinct was to pretend it hadn't been her, to blend into the crowd and disappear before anyone could identify her as the culprit. But the guard, despite his training to remain stoic and unmovable during the ceremony, had clearly felt the impact. His eyes, which had been focused straight ahead in military bearing, flickered slightly in her direction. The gum clung stubbornly to his cheek, its pink color making it impossible to ignore or pretend it wasn't there. Karen could see other guards in the formation beginning to notice their colleagues' predicament, though their own discipline prevented them from breaking character or formation to address the situation. A family standing nearby had witnessed the entire incident, and Karen could see the mother covering her young daughter's eyes while the father shook his head in disgust. Other tourists were beginning to point and whisper, some even raising their phones to capture this unprecedented breach of royal protocol. Karen's hands trembled as she clutched her phone, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the designer case. The gum represented everything that was wrong with her morning, her trip, and perhaps her entire approach to life. She had been so focused on getting the perfect shot for social media that she had forgotten the most basic rules of courtesy and respect. The guard's eyes met hers for just a fraction of a second, and in that brief moment Karen saw something that made her stomach drop even further. It wasn't anger or outrage that she detected in his gaze, but rather a quiet disappointment that somehow felt worse than any explosive reaction would have been. She wanted to apologize, to somehow explain that it had been an accident, that she wasn't the type of person who would deliberately disrespect someone performing their duty with such dedication and professionalism. But the words wouldn't come, and even if they had, she knew that any attempt to communicate with the guard would only make the situation worse. The ceremonial music continued to play, providing a surreal soundtrack to Karen's mortification. The other guards maintained their positions and bearing, but she could sense a subtle shift in the atmosphere around them. What had been a joyful celebration of tradition had become something uncomfortable and tense. A security officer who had been monitoring the crowd from a discreet distance began moving in Karen's direction. She could see him speaking into a small radio device, probably alerting other personnel to the situation. The realization that she might face legal consequences for her accident sent a fresh wave of panic through her system. Karen looked around desperately for an escape route, but the crowd that had been such an annoyance earlier now formed an impenetrable barrier. She was trapped in a circle of disapproving faces and pointing fingers, with nowhere to run and no way to undo what had just happened. The guard with the gum on his face continued his march, but Karen could see the slight tension in his jaw that suggested he was fighting every instinct to wipe away the foreign object. His commitment to maintaining the ceremony's dignity despite her thoughtless action made her feel even worse about the entire situation. Some tourists near her were beginning to take photos of the guard with the gum still attached to his face, adding insult to injury by turning his professional humiliation into entertainment for social media. Karen realized with growing horror that this incident would likely go viral, making her careless moment a source of international embarrassment. She tried to move backward through the crowd, hoping to create some distance between herself and the scene of her crime, but her distinctive blonde hair and bright white blazer made her easily identifiable. The security officer was getting closer, his expression stern and official as he navigated through the tourists. The ceremony was beginning to wind down, but the damage had been done. Karen's gum remained stubbornly attached to the guard's cheek, a pink symbol of her disrespect that would probably be remembered long after the traditional pageantry was forgotten. She had managed to turn a centuries-old tradition into a spectacle of bad tourist behavior in a matter of seconds. As the guards began their final formations, Karen caught sight of the affected soldier's profile and felt another wave of shame wash over her. He was young, probably not much older than her own nephew back in California, and he was performing his duty with a dignity that she had thoughtlessly violated. The approaching security officer raised his hand to get her attention, and Karen knew that her morning of minor frustrations was about to become something much more serious and complicated. The security officer reached Karen just as the ceremony concluded, his presence commanding immediate attention from the tourists around her. He was a tall, middle-aged man with kind but serious eyes, wearing a discreet earpiece and official identification that marked him as palace security. Karen's heart pounded as he approached, her mind racing through potential explanations that might minimize the severity of what had just occurred. "Excuse me, miss," the officer said in a polite but firm tone that suggested he had dealt with similar tourist incidents before. "I believe we need to have a conversation about what just happened here." His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to handling delicate situations involving both royal protocol and international visitors. Karen felt her face flush with embarrassment as nearby tourists turned to stare at their interaction. Some were still recording with their phones, apparently fascinated by the unfolding drama. She clutched her designer handbag tighter as if it could somehow shield her from the growing attention. "I'm so sorry," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was completely accidental. I would never intentionally disrespect anyone, especially not during such an important ceremony." The words tumbled out in a rush. Her usual confidence completely evaporated in the face of this unprecedented situation. The officer nodded thoughtfully, his expression suggesting that he believed her claim of accidental behavior. "I understand these things can happen, but I'm afraid there are protocols we need to follow. The guard in question will need to be relieved of his duties temporarily to address the situation, and will need to document the incident properly." Karen's stomach dropped as she realized the full implications of her careless moment. Not only had she humiliated herself and disrespected a centuries-old tradition, but she had also disrupted the professional duties of a dedicated serviceman. The guard she had accidentally targeted would now have to leave his post because of her thoughtlessness. Through the dispersing crowd, she could see the affected guard being approached by a superior officer. Even from a distance, Karen could observe the careful, respectful way the gum was being removed from his face, using what appeared to be a small cloth. The entire process was conducted with the same military precision that characterized everything else about the ceremony. "Will he get in trouble?" Karen asked anxiously, genuine concern for the guard's well-being overriding her own embarrassment. "I mean, it wasn't his fault at all. He was just doing his job perfectly, and I was the one who made the mistake." The security officer's expression softened slightly at her obvious distress and concern for the guard's welfare. "He won't face any disciplinary action if that's what you're worried about. These situations are rare, but they do happen occasionally with international tourists. We have procedures in place to handle them professionally." Karen felt a small measure of relief, but it was quickly overshadowed by the realization that her morning's events were far from over. The officer gestured toward a discreet side entrance to the palace grounds, indicating that their conversation would need to continue in a more private setting. As they walked away from the crowd, Karen became acutely aware of the whispers and pointing fingers following their movement. She could imagine the stories these tourists would tell when they returned home, probably embellishing the details with each retelling, until she became the villainous American who deliberately attacked a royal guard. The side entrance led to a small, efficiently organized office space that was clearly designed for handling tourist-related incidents. The walls were lined with official photographs of royal family members and various ceremonial events, creating an atmosphere that reminded Karen of the gravity of her transgression. "Please, have a seat," the officer said, gesturing to a comfortable chair across from a modest desk. "I'll need to get some basic information from you for our incident report, and then we can discuss how to proceed from here." His tone remained professional but not unkind, suggesting that he dealt with upset tourists on a regular basis. Karen sat down carefully, conscious of her designer clothes and the fact that she was probably leaving sweat stains on the fabric. Her hand shook slightly as she reached for her passport and identification documents, wondering if this incident might somehow affect her ability to travel internationally in the future. "I'm Karen Matthews," she said, providing her documents. "I'm here from Los Angeles, just visiting for a few days. I've never been in trouble before, not even a parking ticket back home. I'm really not the kind of person who causes problems." Her voice carried a pleading quality that she hadn't heard from herself since childhood. The officer examined her documents briefly and began filling out what appeared to be a standard incident report form. "I can see that, Mrs. Matthews. Your record shows no previous issues with any international law enforcement agencies. This appears to be simply an unfortunate accident during what should have been an enjoyable cultural experience." As he wrote, Karen found herself studying the photographs on the walls, particularly those showing the changing of the guard ceremony in various weather conditions and seasons. She could see the same dedication and professionalism in every image that she had witnessed firsthand, before ruining it with her carelessness. "What happens now?" she asked, dreading the answer but needing to know what consequences awaited her. "Will there be charges? Will I have to go to court? Will this affect my ability to visit other countries?" The questions poured out as her anxiety overwhelmed her usual composure. The officer looked up from his paperwork with an expression that was surprisingly reassuring. Given that this was clearly accidental and you've been completely cooperative, we're looking at this as a minor incident requiring documentation, rather than any kind of criminal matter. However, there will be some steps we need to take to address the situation properly. Karen felt a wave of relief wash over her, though she sensed there was more to come. The officer's measured tone suggested that while she wouldn't be facing jail time, there would still be consequences for her actions that went beyond simple embarrassment. The guard who was affected has been relieved of his duties for the remainder of his shift, the officer continued. This is standard protocol for any situation that compromises the dignity of the ceremony. While he won't face any punishment, he will miss out on the remainder of today's duties, which some guards consider an honor to perform. The weight of this information settled heavily on Karen's shoulders. She had not only embarrassed herself and disrupted a sacred tradition, but she had also cost a dedicated professional the opportunity to complete his ceremonial duties. The guard's commitment to maintaining his post despite the gum on his face now seemed even more admirable, and her action even more thoughtless. "Is there any way I can apologize to him directly?" Karen asked, surprising herself with the genuineness of her desire to make amends. "I know it won't undo what happened, but I feel terrible that my carelessness affected his day and his duty." The officer paused in his writing and studied Karen's face carefully, as if evaluating the sincerity of her request. After a moment, he set down his pen and leaned back in his chair, his expression becoming more thoughtful than strictly professional. The security officer studied Karen's face for a long moment, weighing her request against established protocols and procedures. His years of experience dealing with tourist incidents had taught him to distinguish between genuine remorse and attempts to manipulate sympathy, and something in Karen's demeanor suggested her desire to apologize was authentic. "That's not typically something we arrange," he said slowly, his tone suggesting he was considering possibilities rather than delivering a final refusal. The guards maintain strict separation from the public during their duties, and personal interactions are generally discouraged to preserve the formality of their role. Karen's face fell slightly, but she nodded in understanding. "Of course, I completely understand. I just felt so terrible about affecting someone who was doing his job so professionally. But I respect whatever rules you have in place." Her response seemed to further convince the officer of her sincerity. Outside the small office, Karen could hear the sounds of the palace grounds returning to their normal afternoon rhythm. Tourist groups were being guided through various areas, their guides pointing out historical details and sharing stories of royal tradition. The everyday nature of these sounds made her own situation feel even more surreal. "However," the officer continued, surprising Karen with his shift in tone, "there might be an alternative way to address your concerns." "Guard Matthews," he paused, apparently realizing he had used the guard's surname. "The gentleman affected by the incident has expressed some curiosity about what exactly happened. Perhaps a brief supervised conversation might be beneficial for both parties." Karen's eyes widened with a mixture of hope and renewed anxiety. The prospect of facing the guard directly was both exactly what she wanted and absolutely terrifying. She would have to look into the eyes of someone whose professional dignity she had compromised and attempt to explain her inexcusable carelessness. "Would that really be possible?" she asked, her voice barely concealing her nervousness. "I mean, if he's willing to speak with me, I would be incredibly grateful for the opportunity. I just want him to know that it wasn't intentional disrespect, even though I understand how it must have appeared." The officer reached for his radio and spoke in low, discreet tones to someone on the other end. Karen caught only fragments of the conversation, but she heard references to tourist incident, voluntary, meeting, and supervised interaction. The official nature of the language reminded her that even this potential apology would be conducted under formal circumstances. After a brief exchange, he turned back to Karen with what might have been the hint of a smile. "Guard Matthews has agreed to a brief conversation, provided it takes place here under supervision and remains focused on resolving the incident professionally. He's currently off duty due to the morning's events, so this won't interfere with any active responsibilities." Karen felt her heart rate increase as the reality of the impending meeting sank in. She had spent the last hour imagining how she might apologize if given the chance, but now that the opportunity was materializing, she felt completely unprepared. What could she possibly say that would adequately address the embarrassment she had caused? "Thank you so much for arranging this," she said, smoothing her hair nervously and checking her reflection in the small mirror of her compact. She realized how ridiculous it was to worry about her appearance at a moment like this. But old habits died hard, even in extraordinary circumstances. The officer completed his paperwork while they waited, occasionally glancing up to observe Karen's increasingly nervous fidgeting. She had stopped chewing gum entirely, the irony of her situation making the very thought of it nauseating. Her designer handbag sat forgotten in her lap as she mentally rehearsed various apologies, none of which seemed adequate. A soft knock on the office door interrupted her anxious preparations. The security officer stood up and opened it to reveal a young man in civilian clothes, who was unmistakably the guard Karen had inadvertently assaulted. Without his ceremonial uniform and tall hat, he appeared younger and more approachable, though his military bearing remained evident in his posture. "Ma'am," he said with a polite nod as he entered the room. His voice carried a slight accent that Karen couldn't immediately place, and his manner was formal, but not unfriendly. "I understand you wanted to speak with me about this morning's incident." Karen stood up quickly, nearly dropping her handbag in her haste. Face to face with the person she had wronged, all her carefully planned words evaporated. "I am so incredibly sorry," she blurted out, her voice cracking slightly with emotion. "What happened was completely accidental, but that doesn't make it any less inexcusable. I ruined your ceremony and embarrassed you in front of all those people." The guard, whose first name she realized she still didn't know, studied her with intelligent eyes that seemed to be evaluating her sincerity. His expression was neutral but not hostile, suggesting that he was willing to listen to what she had to say before forming his final judgment. "I appreciate you saying that," he replied after a moment. "I could tell from your reaction that it wasn't intentional. These things happen more often than you might think, though usually it's small children throwing things rather than adults with gum." There was the slightest hint of humor in his voice, which gave Karen hope that the situation might be more salvageable than she had feared. "Really?" Karen asked, surprised by this revelation. "I thought I had committed some unprecedented breach of protocol that would be talked about for years." The idea that her incident was part of a broader category of tourist mishaps was oddly comforting. "Last month, a toddler threw a toy soldier at my colleague during the ceremony," the guard continued, his expression softening slightly. "The month before that, someone's hat blew off in the wind and landed on another guard's bayonet. We're trained to handle these situations without breaking character, though I admit the gum was a new challenge." Karen felt some of the tension leave her shoulders as she realized that while her action had been thoughtless, it wasn't the earth-shattering diplomatic incident she had imagined. "I feel terrible that you had to leave your post because of my carelessness," she said. "The officer told me that completing the ceremony is considered an honor, and I took that away from you." The guard glanced at the security officer before responding, apparently checking that it was appropriate to share his perspective. "It is an honor to serve, and yes, I was disappointed to miss the remainder of today's duties. But I've been performing ceremonies for 3 years now, and I'll have many more opportunities. One tourist's accident doesn't diminish my overall service." His gracious response made Karen feel both better and worse about the situation. Better because he didn't seem to harbor any personal resentment toward her, but worse because his professionalism highlighted how poorly she had handled herself as a representative of international tourism. "Is there anything I can do to make amends?" she asked earnestly. "I know I can't undo what happened, but if there's any way I can contribute something positive to offset the negative impact of my actions, I'd like to try." The guard considered her question seriously, his expression thoughtful. The security officer remained silent, apparently content to let the two of them work through their interaction without interference unless it became necessary. "Actually," the guard said slowly, "there might be something you could do that would be genuinely helpful, though it's probably not what you're expecting." Karen leaned forward expectantly, genuinely curious about what the guard might suggest. His thoughtful expression indicated that whatever he was considering wasn't a simple gesture, but something more meaningful and substantial. The security officer also seemed interested in hearing the proposal, his eyebrows raising slightly as he waited for the guard to continue. We often have visitors who come to the palace with genuine interest in our history and traditions, the guard began, his voice taking on a more passionate tone. But we also see many tourists who treat the ceremony as just another photo opportunity, without really understanding what they're witnessing or why it matters. Karen felt a flush of recognition, realizing that she had probably fallen into the latter category herself. Her primary concern that morning had indeed been capturing the perfect Instagram moment, rather than appreciating the cultural significance of what she was experiencing. What if, the guard continued, instead of just posting photos of your London trip on social media, you used your experience today to help educate other travelers about the importance of respectful tourism? You could share what you learned about how tourist behavior affects the people who are just trying to do their jobs with dignity. The suggestion caught Karen completely off guard. She had expected him to ask for a donation to a military charity, or perhaps a written apology to be filed with his superior officers. Instead, he was proposing that she turn her embarrassing mistake into an opportunity for education and awareness. You mean write about what happened today? She asked, trying to understand exactly what he was envisioning. Share the story of how I accidentally disrespected you and what I learned from the experience? Exactly, the guard replied with growing enthusiasm. Most tourists aren't malicious. They're just thoughtless or uninformed. If you could help others understand how their actions affect real people, it might prevent similar incidents in the future. Your story could actually have a positive impact. The security officer nodded approvingly at the suggestion. That's quite thoughtful, Guard Matthews. We do receive feedback that many tourists would benefit from better understanding of appropriate behavior during ceremonial events. A first-person account from someone who made a mistake might resonate more than official guidelines. Karen considered the proposal carefully. It would mean admitting her error publicly and potentially subjecting herself to criticism from strangers online. But it would also give meaning to an otherwise purely negative experience and might genuinely help other travelers avoid similar mistakes. I like that idea, she said slowly, warming to the concept. I could write about the whole experience, from my thoughtless behavior to meeting you and learning about the impact of tourist actions on the people who work in these historic places. It might help others think more carefully about their own behavior. The guard smiled for the first time since entering the office, and Karen realized it completely transformed his appearance. Gone was the stern, formal military bearing, replaced by the warmth of someone who genuinely cared about his work and wanted others to understand its value. I should probably mention, he added with a slight grin, that my name is actually James Matthews, not Guard Matthews. When I'm not wearing the uniform, I'm just a regular person who happens to have a job with unusual responsibilities and protocols. Karen laughed, a sound of genuine relief and growing comfort with the situation. I'm Karen Matthews too, actually. Well, Karen Matthews Johnson before my divorce, but I went back to Matthews. What are the odds that the guard I accidentally assaulted would share my maiden name? The coincidence broke whatever remaining tension existed in the room. Even the security officer chuckled at the unlikely connection between the two protagonists in the morning's drama. Maybe that explains why the gum found its target so accurately, James suggested with mock seriousness. Matthew's family magnetic attraction, his ability to find humor in the situation that had caused him professional embarrassment, impressed Karen with its generosity and maturity. I promise I'll write something thoughtful and educational, Karen said earnestly. And I'll be honest about my own behavior and motivations. If other tourists can learn from my mistake, then maybe something good can come out of this whole mess. I'd like to read it when you're finished, if you don't mind, James said. Not to approve or censor it, but because I'm curious to see how the experience looks from your perspective. It might help me understand tourists better, too. Karen found herself genuinely excited about the writing project for the first time since the incident occurred. Instead of trying to hide or minimize her embarrassing mistake, she would transform it into something potentially valuable for other travelers and the people whose jobs brought them into contact with international tourists. Actually, she said, struck by a sudden inspiration, would you be willing to contribute your own perspective to the piece? Not just my side of the story, but also what it's like to be on the receiving end of thoughtless tourist behavior. It might be even more powerful if readers could see both perspectives. James considered the proposal thoughtfully. I'd have to check with my supervisors about that. There are rules about public statements and media interactions, but if they approve it, I think it could be really valuable to show both sides of these interactions. The security officer made a note on his paperwork. I can facilitate that conversation with the appropriate personnel. This kind of educational outreach actually aligns well with some of our visitor education initiatives. We're always looking for ways to help tourists understand the human side of the traditions they come to witness. Karen felt a growing sense of purpose and excitement about the project. What had started as the worst moment of her London trip was transforming into something potentially meaningful and positive. She could already envision the article taking shape, balancing honest self-reflection with genuine respect for the traditions and people she had inadvertently disrespected. "There's one more thing," James said, his expression becoming more serious again. "If you do write this story, I hope you'll include something about why we do these ceremonies in the first place. They're not just tourist attractions or photo opportunities. They're living connections to centuries of history and service." "Of course," Karen agreed immediately. "I realize now that I came here this morning without really understanding what I was witnessing. That was part of the problem. I was so focused on getting the perfect shot that I forgot I was watching real people performing meaningful work." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with James sharing insights about the history and significance. 3 weeks later, Karen sat in her favorite coffee shop in Beverly Hills, putting the finishing touches on what had become the most meaningful piece of writing she had ever attempted. Her laptop screen displayed the collaborative article she and James had created, titled "When Tourism Goes Wrong: A Royal Guard and a Careless Tourist Find Common Ground." The piece had evolved far beyond her initial conception. What began as a simple apology had transformed into a comprehensive exploration of cultural respect, the human cost of thoughtless tourism, and the unexpected connections that could emerge from embarrassing mistakes. James had received approval from his superiors to contribute his perspective, and their combined voices created a narrative that was both educational and genuinely moving. Karen reread James's section describing the emotional impact of tourist incidents on the guards. He had written with surprising eloquence about the pride they took in their ceremonial duties, and how disruptions affected not just the immediate moment, but their sense of professional accomplishment. His words helped readers understand that behind the stoic facades were real people with feelings and dedication to their craft. Her own contribution had required brutal honesty about her motivations and behavior. She had described her frustration with the crowds, her obsession with getting the perfect social media shot, and her general lack of awareness about the significance of what she was witnessing. Writing about her own thoughtlessness had been uncomfortable but ultimately therapeutic. The response to the article, which had been published on a popular travel blog, exceeded both their expectations. Comments poured in from travelers sharing their own stories of cultural mishaps and newfound awareness. Several tour guides had contacted Karen to say they were incorporating the article into their pre-tour briefings to help tourists understand appropriate behavior. Most surprisingly, the story had caught the attention of a documentary filmmaker interested in exploring the broader theme of tourism's impact on local communities and traditions. Karen had agreed to be interviewed, seeing it as another opportunity to expand the educational reach of their message. Her phone buzzed with a text message from James. "Just saw the latest comment thread on the article. A family from Australia says they completely changed how they approach cultural sites after reading our story. This is really making a difference." Karen smiled as she typed her response. "I never imagined that accidentally spitting gum on a royal guard would lead to the most meaningful project of my life. Thank you for turning my worst moment into something positive." Their correspondence had continued regularly since that day in the palace office. What had started as a formal collaboration had evolved into a genuine friendship based on mutual respect and shared commitment to their cause. James had even sent her photos from subsequent ceremonies, noting the improved behavior he was observing from tourists who seemed more aware and respectful. The documentary crew was scheduled to arrive in London next month to film interviews with both Karen and James at Buckingham Palace. The irony of returning to the scene of her embarrassment as an invited guest and educational advocate was not lost on her. The security officer who had handled her case, Officer Williams, had agreed to participate as well, sharing his perspective on managing tourist incidents. Karen had also received an unexpected invitation to speak at a travel industry conference about responsible tourism practices. The organizers had read the article and wanted her to address travel agents and tour operators about educating their clients. The idea of standing before industry professionals as an expert on tourist behavior would have seemed absurd just months earlier. Her social media presence had transformed as well. Instead of posting carefully curated vacation photos designed to generate envy and likes, she now shared educational content about cultural respect and meaningful travel experiences. Her follower count had actually increased as people responded positively to her authentic approach. The divorce that had initially motivated her London trip felt like ancient history now. The personal growth and sense of purpose she had discovered through this experience had given her life a direction she never would have anticipated. She was considering writing a book about responsible tourism, expanding on the themes she and James had explored in their article. Her phone rang, displaying an international number she now recognized as James calling from London. Despite the time difference, they had maintained regular communication about their ongoing projects and the continued response to their story. "Karen, you're not going to believe this," James said excitedly when she answered. "I just got off a call with the tourism board. They want to develop an official educational program based on our article. They're talking about incorporating our story and recommendations into visitor information, packets and online resources." Karen felt a surge of pride and amazement at how far their collaboration had come. "That's incredible, James. When I think about where this all started, with me hiding in that office chair wishing I could disappear, it seems impossible that we'd end up here. The best part," James continued, "is that they want both of us to be involved in developing the program. You'd be the tourist perspective consultant, and I'd represent the cultural site employee viewpoint. It would be a real partnership in creating something that could affect thousands of visitors." The opportunity represented everything Karen had hoped their project might achieve. Instead of just writing about the problems of thoughtless tourism, they would be actively involved in creating solutions that could prevent other tourists from making similar mistakes and other cultural workers from experiencing similar disruptions. "I'm absolutely interested," Karen said without hesitation. "This feels like the natural evolution of what we started. And honestly, it gives me a chance to make amends not just to you, but to everyone who works in tourism and cultural sites around the world." They spent the next hour discussing the practical details of the program development, the research they would need to conduct, and the potential reach of their educational initiative. Karen found herself taking notes and sketching out ideas with an enthusiasm she hadn't felt for any project since college. As their conversation wound down, James brought up something that had been on both their minds. "You know, when I agreed to meet with you that day, I expected a quick apology, and then to never hear from you again. I never imagined we'd become genuine collaborators and friends. I think that's the most important lesson in our whole story," Karen replied thoughtfully. "Sometimes the worst mistakes can lead to the most meaningful connections, but only if we're willing to face them honestly and work to make them right." After ending the call, Karen sat back in her chair and reflected on the unexpected journey that had begun with a piece of carelessly discarded gum. The woman who had traveled to London seeking validation through social media posts had discovered something far more valuable: a sense of purpose and the satisfaction of meaningful work that helped others. 1 year later, Karen stood at the entrance to Buckingham Palace wearing a visitor's badge that identified her as an official consultant for the Royal Tourism Education Initiative. The palace grounds looked exactly as they had during her first disastrous visit, but everything else about the experience was completely different. This time she was there by invitation, carrying a briefcase full of research and proposals rather than a phone aimed at capturing the perfect selfie. The program she and James had developed had exceeded all expectations. Their educational materials were now distributed to tourist groups in 12 languages, and similar initiatives had been adopted by cultural sites across Europe. The documentary featuring their story had won an award at an international film festival, bringing even more attention to the importance of respectful tourism. James met her at the same side entrance where she had been escorted in shame a year earlier. He was in civilian clothes again, having recently been promoted to a position that focused specifically on visitor education and cultural liaison work. The role had been created partly in response to the success of their collaboration. "Ready for the big presentation?" he asked with a grin that had become familiar through their months of video calls and collaborative work. Today, They would be presenting their findings to representatives from tourism boards across the Commonwealth, potentially expanding their program to dozens of countries. I still can't quite believe this is real, Karen admitted as they walked through corridors lined with portraits of monarchs and historical artifacts. Sometimes I wonder if this is all an elaborate dream brought on by gum-induced guilt. Their friendship had deepened over the months of working together, built on mutual respect and a shared commitment to their cause. Karen had visited London 3 more times for program development, and James had spent a week in Los Angeles consulting with American tourism organizations. What had begun as damage control had evolved into a genuine partnership. The presentation went better than either of them had dared hope. Government officials and tourism industry leaders responded enthusiastically to their data, showing measurable improvements in tourist behavior at sites that had implemented their educational approaches. Several countries committed to pilot programs, and funding was approved for a comprehensive expansion of their initiative. During the lunch break, Officer Williams, who had been promoted to head of tourist relations, pulled Karen aside for a private conversation. "You know," he said with a knowing smile, "in 30 years of handling tourist incidents, I've never seen one lead to such positive outcomes. You two have accomplished something remarkable." "It feels surreal," Karen replied honestly. "I came here originally as the worst kind of tourist, focused only on what I could get out of the experience. Now I spend my time trying to help others avoid making the same mistakes." "That's exactly why your message resonates," Officer Williams explained. "You're not lecturing from a position of superiority. You're sharing hard-won wisdom from someone who's been there and learned from it. That authenticity makes all the difference." The afternoon session focused on implementation strategies and long-term sustainability of their program. Karen found herself fielding questions from tourism ministers and cultural site directors with confidence she never would have imagined possessing. Her expertise had been earned through experience, research, and genuine dedication to the cause. As the formal presentations concluded, James and Karen found themselves standing in the same office where they had first met face-to-face. The space looked identical, but the context had transformed completely. Instead of being summoned for disciplinary reasons, they were now recognized experts in their field. "Do you ever miss the simplicity of just trying to get good vacation photos?" James asked with gentle teasing, remembering Karen's original motivation for visiting the palace. "Never," Karen answered immediately. "I got something so much better than good photos. I got a purpose and a friendship that has changed my entire life. Plus, I've learned to take much better pictures now that I actually pay attention to what I'm photographing, instead of just trying to show off." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. A young palace staff member entered with an official-looking document bearing royal seals and signatures. "Mrs. Matthews," she said formally, "I've been asked to present you with this official recognition from the royal household for your contributions to improving cultural understanding and tourism, education." Karen accepted the document with hands that trembled slightly from emotion. The formal language commended her work in transforming a regrettable incident into meaningful, educational reform that had positively impacted thousands of visitors and cultural workers. "I need to ask you something," she said to James after the staff member left. "When you first suggested that I write about what happened, did you have any idea it would lead to all of this? Were you thinking strategically about creating change, or were you just trying to help a guilt-ridden tourist feel better?" James considered the question carefully before answering. "Honestly, I was mostly thinking about preventing other guards from having to deal with similar situations. But I also saw something in your reaction that day that made me think you were genuinely capable of learning and growing from the experience. I hoped you might help a few other tourists think more carefully about their behavior. And now we're consulting with governments and appearing in documentaries," Karen marveled. "It's proof that you never know where sincere efforts to make amends might lead." Their return flight to Los Angeles wasn't until the following evening, giving them time for a celebratory dinner and reflection on how far they had come. As they walked through the London streets, Karen noticed details she had completely missed during her first visit. Street musicians performing with skill and passion, historical buildings that told stories spanning centuries, local people going about their daily lives with dignity and purpose. "I see everything differently now," she told James as they paused outside a small church that had stood for over 500 years. "Travel used to be about collecting experiences and proving I had been somewhere interesting. Now it's about understanding places and people, making connections and learning from differences. That transformation is exactly what we're hoping to inspire in other tourists, James replied. Your personal growth is the template for the broader change we're trying to create. The next morning, before heading to the airport, Karen made one final visit to Buckingham Palace as an ordinary tourist. She joined a crowd gathered for the changing of the guard ceremony, but this time her focus was entirely different. Instead of pushing for the best camera angle, she watched the ceremony with genuine appreciation for its historical significance and respect for the dedication of the guards performing their duties. When the ceremony concluded, she didn't immediately check her phone to post photos. Instead, she spent a few moments reflecting on the journey that had brought her back to this place, with such a different perspective and purpose. The young guard who had taken James's place in the formation caught her eye and nodded slightly in recognition. Word of her transformation and subsequent work had spread through the regiment, making her something of a legend among the guards as the tourist who had turned a mistake into meaningful change. As Karen boarded her flight back to Los Angeles, she carried with her not just official recognition and new business cards identifying her as a cultural tourism consultant, but a profound sense of satisfaction that came from work that mattered. The woman who had once measured travel success in social media likes now measured it in positive changes made and connections formed. Her phone buzzed with a message from James as the plane taxied for takeoff. Safe travels, partner. Looking forward to our next project together. Who would have thought that a piece of gum could launch such an adventure? Karen smiled as she typed her response. Best accidental career change ever. Here's to turning mistakes into opportunities and strangers into friends. As London disappeared beneath the clouds, Karen reflected on the unexpected truth she had discovered. Sometimes the most embarrassing moments of our lives can become the most meaningful, but only if we have the courage to face them honestly and the determination to transform them into something positive. Her journey from thoughtless tourist to respected advocate proved that redemption was possible for anyone willing to do the work required to earn it.